Hi everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I know it's early, but we have a very special guest here to talk to us. She is a human rights advocate based in Mexico. She has worked with multiple nonprofit organizations, and she's on the forefront of activism in Guerrero State, Mexico. She has been involved in helping the parents affected by the 43 disappeared, which you might not have heard of, but it was a huge case in Latin American countries. Just from reading about her these past couple of weeks, I've realized she has a strength, a courage that many of us will never need. She speaks up against the atrocities her people face time and time again, knowing that she could be killed for doing so. Please welcome the brave Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriquez. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for inviting me and come here this early, as you said. Well, my name is Maria Luisa Aguilar. I go by Malu, so please feel free to call me Malu. I'm a human rights advocate at Mexico. I'm now based in Mexico City, but as Fiona said, I worked for a long time in Guerrero, in the south of Mexico, in one of the poorest and most remote areas, mainly with indigenous communities, but also with victims of what we call gross violations of human rights, which mean violations of your rights that put in risk your integrity, like torture, disappearances, killings. And I do mostly what we call international strategies, working with international organisms and other organizations, non-governmental organizations that could help us to make visible or to change things in specific cases that we work with. I'm now part of a team that is called Human Rights Center. It's a long name. It's the Miguel Agustín Pro Juárez Human Rights Center, so Centro Provinces here. And we are a group of 30 people, around 30 people, many of us from the same age, young people who advocate, who do legal aid, who do strategies for communications, also who work with other organizations at the local level and with groups of victims that want to get organized and need tools to get organized and to know how to claim for their rights. And we try to help them in getting their voice out and get some justice.
For the people who don't know about the human crisis in Mexico, can you explain the situation a little bit more so people can understand?
Well, we call them a human rights crisis because the numbers have been very horrible in the last years, and the response from the state hasn't been sufficient enough. So since 2006 or so, the then president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, started to make what he called the war on crime or the war on drug trafficking. And basically what this means is to put the armed forces on the street to do regular policing tasks. And what that meant in many places in Mexico was that violence started to get more and more difficult, more and more common. And so now we have the rise numbers of murders, of intentional murders in many parts of Mexico went up like very high. In 12 years or so we had 250,000 murders committed without really knowing in how many of those events state agents took part of it. We have a number of 40,000 people disappear, so people who we know were in some kind of situation that state or non-state agents took part of their disappearances, and we and their families don't know anything about their whereabouts. We have a crisis of forensics. It's very difficult to say it, but many of those people who were disappeared, their final destination were mass graves. You know, like just the organized crime or the state agents just get rid of their bodies. And so we have at least 1,000 mass graves in Mexico that we know exist, that the state agents know that families or other people found it, and that all the remains that are there, or the body parts that are there, we don't know who they are from. So a lot of the families of those people who are disappeared are the ones that are pushing us forward to say, like, we need changes, we need to do some things. So first to know where are our relatives, but also to stop this. I mean, people cannot disappear in one country that calls itself a democracy.
What are some specific projects have you worked on?
Well, one of the projects that Fiona portrayed in the video, it's a case of 43 students that were disappeared in one night. They were college students that were training for being teachers. So many of them were, I don't know how old are you, but like they were around 18 to 21. They were just starting their training as teachers in Guerrero. Most of them come from very poor areas of the state. So this is their only opportunity to access education. They really cannot afford to go to a college, even like a local college in Guerrero. So this school where they were part of, it's a boarding school, so they get everything that they need to good access education. And in one night, when they were doing some commandeering of buses and activities around, like to go to a demonstration in Mexico City, they were basically chastened by local police, but also now we know there was a larger operation. There was the participation of state, federal police, and with at least the knowledge that things were happening with the armed forces, in a very difficult context to explain, because in Iguala, where the events happen, the organized crime has infiltrated everything in the system. So on one night, 6 people were killed in an operation that took more than 6-7 hours during the night. 2 students were severely injured. One of them, he's still in a vegetative state. The other one was shot on the face and he's still just trying to recover. And 43 students were disappeared. What we know and what it's documented is that they were detained by local police, and then we don't know the whereabouts about that. And then a lot of things happened during the night that are still documented, but what we don't know is what was their destination. And since then, that was in September 2014, their families and their other classmates have been very strong and very powerful to say, this cannot happen anymore, and this needs to be solved. And we cannot just go home and assume that they were killed, because that's what happens in this country. We need to know what happened. And so for the last 4 years, my colleagues and I in Centro Pro and in other organizations, we have been trying to accompany, we say, but it's like to do a lot of work around the case to make sure that these families have truth. And truth sometimes sounds very easy, but truth is about knowing what happened, knowing who was part of these events, but also knowing who does not want us to know what's everything around and how these things could happen in one night in one small place in the middle of Earth.
What dangers does the regular person in Mexico face? What dangers does the regular person in Mexico face every day?
I would say it really depends of where you are in Mexico, who you are in Mexico. It's very different if you are in an urban city, like for example myself, that I now live in Mexico City, which your risks are, like regular criminality, to get robbed, to get robbed in the subway. But in many other parts of Mexico, dangers gets other significance. If you are a woman, you are more vulnerable to be used or killed in many parts of Mexico. If you are a poor person who doesn't speak Spanish, you are more vulnerable to be extorted by the police. So it's also a country with a lot of diversity and a lot of exclusion. So poor people who cannot have access to education or who doesn't have access to basic rights, their most dangerous situation is its daily life. It's not having access to food, water, and just security in a broader sense.
How do you maintain the courage to do this line of work?
I think what makes us, and when I say us, it's like the people who work with victims of human rights. I think what makes us continue our work, it's also the strength of the people we work with. When you see families that come from very poor contexts, when they say, I cannot go home. I mean, I have other children. I know that I need to work. I know that there are some other things that concern myself, but I just cannot go back home and continue my life. I need to know what happened to my kids, and that strength help you to continue and help you to know what is important.
How do you think the lives of teens in Mexico are different than those who are living here?
As I said, Mexico has a lot of diversity. So I could say, for example, I grew up in a more urban context. I went to a private high school. I could understand similarities of maybe what you live around here. But I also seen what a high school is in the mountains in Guerrero, and that's very different. It's not having or having to walk 2 hours to access your classroom, or having to wait to see if you can work to then pay your transportation to access your classroom. Not knowing if you can go to the next year because your family needs to pay for more other primary stuff that could be food, or you need to work on the fields. So I think that's also, and I'm sure it's the same here in the US, but I don't know if in Maine, but the diversity of the situations also makes it very complex to know where you need to work.
Have you seen a change in your work over the past couple of years?
Well, I've seen change not in a good way, if I can say. The last years of the previous administration. In Mexico, we just have a change in presidents. The current president started his administration in December, but for the last years in Mexico, the continuous call from the previous administration was to deny that things were happening in Mexico. So we were country of prosperity and a country where, yeah, things happen, and some human rights violations happen in some places, but really what it is just that we are trying to grow an economy and, you know, like trying to make things invisible. And sometimes it's difficult to say it because nobody wants to go outside of your country and say, you know, things are very bad there, don't go. I don't want to picture it like that, but what it's real and it's needed is to understand what things are happening in your country and do something about it. And that's what we didn't have from the previous administration.
What is one freedom that we have in America that someone who's living in Mexico doesn't have?
You have many, actually. No, I will say that something that in many parts of Mexico is not understood is to live under the rule of law. Because you know the institutions work and you can trust them when you live under the rule of law. And really in Mexico, in some places, that's not something that you have for sure. And that touches everything. That touches to know that food programs will access the people who really need them, but it also touches your integrity in terms that whether you can trust or not the police. So yeah, I would say that's the most complex situation.
The students in this room come from many different backgrounds. What should we know and what should we do to make an impact?
Well, I think the most important thing that you should know is that your diversity is your strength. And so that being diverse and being different from each other, it's something that you should treasure, that you should learn about it, and that you should use.
Have you had any personal loss from what is happening in Mexico?
No, actually no. No, not really. I've seen deteriorating the context where I grew up, and that's very hard. I think trying to understand for what I lived in when I was in high school, for example, and now what I see in the place where my parents live and how things need to be changed, and you don't go out that late, or you need to make sure that you don't cross certain places of the city. So that's something that for me it's still very rare to say it, because I did work in a place that I know that it's violent, that I know that it's insecure, that I know that you have some risks, like in Guerrero. But where I grew up, it was very calm, and things are changing there as well, so it's difficult.
When you were in high school, what were like your interests or things that you liked to do?
Well, I don't think it was human rights, if I might say it. But I was interested in international affairs and knowing more about what was happening in the world. And that kind of led me to what I do now, because after I finished high school, I decided to study international relations. So that was kind of the way that I started to get into this route.
What was your pathway to this career?
Well, as I mentioned, I was more interested like in international affairs, and then I started to read more about things that was happening abroad and how this could impact lives of people. So I was always interested in international law. I didn't want to be a national lawyer. So I started to go more into what it was like public international law and human rights law. But I would say that what really changed the way that I saw human rights, it was when I started to talk with people who work on human rights, who work with human rights victims. So I did some internships in international organizations, and then I went to do my master's in human rights and international law, human rights, and then really what there was when I met people who knew what was happening in their countries and who knew what it was to work with people who were in vulnerable situations, and I just figured out that I needed to know what it was to work really close with victims, and that's how I decided to go back to Mexico and work on Guerrero, close to people who needed justice.
How are we so lucky like to get you in Maine out of the whole places in the world you chose Maine?
Well, it's thanks to Kati actually. Kati has a program that I think it's great, and now that I'm living it, I understand why she puts it together every year, where she brings women from all over the world to know what is happening in Maine, but also to tell more about their work in their countries. And I think it's great because it shows to the ones that we are in the program how things are seen from Maine, but also how diverse Maine is and how things can be also solved from another perspective. So yeah, it's things to continue.
Even though there's like no immediate resolution to what's happening in Mexico, how do you think things could get better?
Yeah, I think there's no easy way to solve this, and I think that's what authorities need to acknowledge as well. But what it can be done is to start strengthening institutions, to really clean up institutions, not to say that things need to be done and then don't do it then. We also need to tell the people in Mexico that justice and truth can be achieved. So that's why we work case by case. We know things need to be done at the structural level, but also finding truth for 43 families that out of 40,000 families that are looking for loved ones can access justice could show a route to say, things can be done. I think we also need to understand that diversity in Mexico needs to be enshrined and really to be taken into account. But also things need to change in terms of for people who are living in very excluded areas need to be put at the center, really, and their needs need to be solved.
Alright, so if I was to be involved in a program called the Telling Room, and where it's very diverse and we get to share our stories and our voices, what's some more advice that you would give us to maybe be even heard more, or I don't know, to have our voices shared?
Well, what I can say is that it's always to say what is in your mind, but it's also to hear what everybody else have to say in the room. And so, as you mentioned, your backgrounds are very different. So you need to say what you want to say, but you also need to learn how to listen to everyone. And I think that always gives you a push to have new things to say after a while. When we start to listening what is happening in a room, then you get more ideas from all over the place.
I'm involved in a youth radio project. Is there any way that we can help your cause?
Yeah, you can always talk about what things are happening in Mexico, to push people to read other stuff, to know what is happening, to understand why people who live in contexts like Mexico, but also from Central America, need to migrate and come to the US because they feel forced to come here. I think that's something that it always helps.
So what are your thoughts on immigration to the US?
I think we have been talking about this in the last days with Katia and with Marsha, but I think what is most important is to understand or to know and read about clear data that show you where people come from, and also where are they running from, and also to know that polarizing discourses, which happen also in Mexico. I mean, we also have these discussions in Mexico of like, why people from Central America want to come across Mexico or want to stay in Mexico. So I think what is very important is to know what really is happening, and also to know how also people who migrate can give us a lot to our communities and to our diverse community.
Does everyone living in Mexico have the same legal access to finding their family?
No, that's one of the biggest problems, is that the crisis is so overwhelmed that who should be giving legal access to these families is the state. I mean, we shouldn't be doing this. I mean, when I say we, like non-governmental organizations should not be doing this. We should be giving responses to the families should be the state, and the problem is that we don't have that. Institutions do not give answers to families. They don't look for them. The families have to look for them. The families need to push prosecutors to go out and look for the relatives in the field. So that's one of the main problems, actually. That our capacities are not enough for answering to everyone who's looking for a relative.
Okay, we have just about 20 minutes left, so it's your guys' chance to ask questions if you have any. Wiley.
What are some dangers that you or other advocates face for speaking your mind?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I have to say that it's very different from depending where you are in Mexico. So my colleagues that work at grassroots organizations or at very local organizations, their risks are very high because everything that you saw on the video and that I explained, it's much more easy to trigger actions against human rights defenders in the local areas. At an urban city like where I live, or with an organization that has a lot of international attention, like the one that I work in, risks get more sophisticated. So, for example, some of my colleagues, where their phones were hacked, we documented that it was made by state agents because that software only came from state agents. And then we were able to document that it wasn't just human rights defenders, but also journalists and other activists that were working in different issues. Smear campaigns. So a lot of people say, no, you are trying just to, make difficult that the families should go home and wait in their homes because you are like doing business with them, and those kind of things that really puts you in some kind of danger, because also that gives them then other opportunities to continue to delegitimize your work. But also, I would say that another sector that is very fragile in Mexico, it's journalists. Mexico is one of the more risky countries for journalists, and that's another freedom that it's always at risk in Mexico, especially for people who work in the States.
Anybody else? Addie?
With our current political climate in America, what are some things you think American high school students should keep in mind when thinking about countries in crisis like Mexico or any other things?
Yeah, I think what you should keep in mind is that things are very different in some other countries, and that immigration is nothing that it's new. It's also something that you should keep in mind. And maybe what you should try to remember all the time is that we are a region that has always been enriched by diversity, and that sometimes it's good to remember that and go back to know how things have been moving around in the last 8 years.
Mr. Hart.
So it seems like your work focuses on communities and NGOs. Things beyond the state, is that mostly because government officials are too afraid to take a bold stance, or because they're part of the problem?
No, definitely because most of them are part of the problem. So, I mean, obviously, we don't always try to just work against the state. We want institutions to be strengthened. We know there are people in the institutions you can work with, but in most of the cases, the authorities are part of the problem. So things need to change also within the institutions.
All right, does anybody else have any questions? No? All right. Oh. Well, we hope so. We really hope so. The current president won with the discourse of saying that Mexicans were fed up of corruption and violence, and that things needed to change. And they have good signs. For example, in this case that I'm working on, in the 43 students case, the previous administration made an official version of what happened since the first days that was impossible to believe. And now the current president said, we know that everybody says that this case is not solved. We know the only truth in this case is that there is no truth, so we're going to do something else. And they know they cannot solve 40,000 cases, so they are trying to pick emblematic cases and say, we need to change what's happening in Mexico. They are putting also a lot of efforts in terms of programs towards poverty, which I think it's good. But it's still
starting. So I think what we are going to see is that if in this year things actually change, when human rights are committed under his watch, and whether he says, okay, that this authority was part of it, so it has to be held accountable. If we start seeing those things, we're going to start seeing some things improving in Mexico.
Are you in the school?
All right, anybody else?
Taping it for? Have you tell them today? Okay, cool. Is that what Justice for Women, the group has yours? It's good that you do.
I think it's I mean, it might be very complex to answer that. But I will say a couple of things. One is that nobody's held accountable in Mexico. And that's one problem. So impunity is not something that comes from the last 10 years. It's something that comes from a long time ago. We did have kind of something similar that happened in the South Con with dirty wars in Mexico. So when state violence was something very clear that we're like chasing political dissidents in Mexico in the 60s. And we don't know anything about that in Mexico. It's not something that was, persecuted and cleared up and then somebody held accountable. So when you have a continuum of impunity for decades, everything can just like continue to embrace in institutions. It's a way to live within the institutions. And the other thing is it's poverty. It's really to have 50% of our population in poverty. It just deters you from growing. I mean, when you have to be worried about what your children are gonna eat, it's something that just touches everything. I would say those two things are core to understand what is happening in Mexico.
Alright, anybody else? Well, I have a question. So, have you faced any biases or discrimination throughout your career?
Yeah, I'm a woman, so that always puts you in a different context. That's key, I would say. Yeah, women in Mexico continue to suffer a lot of violence, and I have to say it's very difficult to find also women who wants to work on giving voices to other women. And that's what we try to do in Pro, my career.
We've heard you, since you came here, talk about this idea of impunity. And that's not a concept that is widely understood here. Could you explain what that means when you use that term?
Yeah, I have been talking to Katia about this because it's really difficult to put some words. I don't know. I don't think it's even like a language barrier, but it's a way that everything works in Mexico. So yeah, holding accountable perpetrators, but also holding accountable regular crimes. Like 98% of the crimes in Mexico that are denounced, so that doesn't mean that are committed, but that are actually denounced, are not solved. Nobody gets actually held accountable for crimes. But also you have a lot of people who are in jail for without knowing actually why they were detained, or they were detained and they were tortured and then put in jail. And they can spend 5 years without a sentence, and then when they can prove, if they can prove that they were tortured, they will just be released, and nobody will actually say like, oh, I'm sorry. But it's also, so it is a thing of justice in terms of the justice system, but it's also about lack of transparency. So we don't know where all the money that goes, that are should go to different programs actually goes to. It's also about how in different places in Mexico, not everywhere, but in different places in Mexico, you cannot really say where's the line between crime and authorities. So like in Guerrero, in Iguala, in this context that we saw in the video, criminality has really taken all the institutions. And so when you have to face those kind of things, you can feel the impunity. You can sense it. You cannot maybe describe it, but it's the lack of trust that you have in those contexts that any kind of institution will work on.
Okay, so we only have about 7 minutes left, so if you guys have a question, you should ask it now. Nobody? Okay. Max?
What are your thoughts on the wall?
Well, I think that a wall wouldn't solve anything, really. What we have seen in Mexico is that whenever we want to put walls, people still migrate. And when I say this, we have tried to put all sorts of walls in the last decade in Mexico. I'm not saying in the north border. The last administration in Mexico wanted to work with the US to make our southern border with Central America more militarized. So for 6 years we saw a lot of people who were detained and taken back to their home countries. And what happened was, so that wasn't a physical wall, but it was harder actually, because then you have a lot of armed forces on the south border. And what happened is that people still needed to go to look for something better and for safety in other places, and it made it more difficult for them to try to reach the US. So they had to go to routes that were more risky, where they faced abuses, where they faced extortion, where they were trafficked by crime in Mexico. So, yeah, it might work for political aspects in here, and I'm sure it's much complex than what I understand. But it really won't solve the main issue that people need to leave their countries because they don't have a good life there. They need to find some other places to go.
Okay, so I have another question. Do you think tourism or like laws, like trade laws between the US or Mexico are beneficial to like the economy, or is it worse?
No, I think the binational relation with of Mexico and the US goes far more beyond that immigration. So tourism, economic development, trade, it's something that is very important, and it's something that needs to continue to grow. I think for what I've seen is that Mexico should approach many of the benefits that has from this trade and put it into service to the people of Mexico. And I'm sure that's what you also need in the other side of the border. But really, I don't really think that, oh no, that the problem is that everybody needs to be isolated. Not at all. And it's also about how our communities have been living together for so many years. So I think the Mexican community in Mexico is now the second largest minority for the last, many years. And so instead of maybe trying to say, oh, these things should stop, I think what we should go back and learn is how much we have grown together in the last years.
Okay, Kathy?
Remembering something I heard you say yesterday, which astounded me, that money sent by Mexicans in the U.S. back to Mexico is the second largest source of revenue in your economy. Which tells us how inclined we are.
Yeah, and also tells you a lot about how many impoverished zones in Mexico depend of what people is doing here in the U.S. And how the Mexican state is not doing what its job about. It's rather like the Mexicans who are outside that are doing the job from the Mexican state.
Alright, so we only have like 1 minute left. Thank you all for coming here today. Can we give our guests a round of applause? I hope you guys were able to take something away from this and learn a few things. If you guys had any more questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking in the big group, you're welcome to come up and ask your questions personally. Okay. Oh, and if you guys want to keep up with Miss Aguilar, just send me an email. And yeah, thank you guys.